My name is Madi Partovi, and this is my husband.
Dr. Ryan Partovi.
And today I'd like to share with our community our experience as each spike protein test results roll in. And I'll tell you what my experience is. When I'm about to click and open that email, I take a deep breath. I'm relieved when I see a low result. And then when I see a result that is off the charts or very high, I have this concern that lives in my body. And Dr. Ryan, I'd like to ask you what is the SARS-CoV-2 antibody? What is the test?
Yeah, so I was going to say that anyway, so I'm glad you asked me.
The spike protein test.
Right. So our spike protein test is actually the spike protein antibody test, because anytime you are looking for spike protein and you actually are looking for the actual protein itself, the only way to actually detect that is with a biopsy, which most people don't want to have. And this just has to do with the way our testing technology is. If there's antigens like the spike protein that are bonded to the tissue, you're not going to find them floating around in the blood, but you will find them on a biopsy. But if you are then looking for sort of an indirect measure, then what you can look for is the anti-spike protein antibody titers, or what we just call spike protein antibodies. And that is basically, it's a kind of an indirect measurement, and it's an indication of one of two or three things. First of all, it could be that there's a high level of residual spike protein, either post-COVID, in the case of like long COVID. It could also be someone is continuously being exposed either to people in around them who are producing spike protein from getting boosted. And we now know that the spike protein production from the vaccines and boosters can last for at least a year in some people. They told us 2 weeks. It's actually much longer, certainly in some people. And so that's the second route of exposure that might, to spike protein, that might cause those elevation in antibody titers. And then really the third group are going to be people who have developed an autoimmune response to the spike protein. Sometimes people already have an autoimmune condition, or they're just prone to sort of allergies, eczema, atopic conditions generally. And then there are 23 different peptides that are similar between the COVID virus, specifically the spike protein, and the various human peptides. And so because of that, those can become antigens that then provoke an autoimmune response in some people. And the reason why it's some people is because we all have genetic differences in our immune system, which are defined by what are called human lymphocytic antigen haplotypes, or HLA haplotypes, which really we get half of them from our mother, half of them from our father, and they combine to make up our unique immune system. Go
I'm going to
ahead.
pause you right
Sure.
there, and I'm going to clarify a couple of things.
Yeah.
And I'm going to invite you to provide really brief answers.
Sure.
COVID-19 did not arise from natural evolution, correct?
Well, it definitely arose through directed evolution. So evolution was still involved, but it was a directed evolution in a lab versus a natural in the wild evolution. Your statement is the evolution part, yes, but natural, no. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And am I correct in saying that if someone continues to get recurring natural cases of COVID, and then there's another person who continues to not only get those recurring cases of COVID, but continues to get boosted, what happens?
Well, the person that's continuing to get boosted is continuing to get, in the case of the mRNA, they're getting a specified dose of the mRNA, which then results in a particular level of spike protein production, which is often higher than what we see in natural infection. And it's exclusively the spike protein, which we know from research from the Salk Institute in San Diego, which is the gold standard of vaccine research globally. And we know this from literally a paper that was published in April of 2021, that the spike protein is the mechanism by which COVID exerts its cytotoxicity, specifically its cardiotoxicity. And again, we knew this in April of 2021. And around that same time, the 6-month post-market data came out on the vaccine showing no efficacy, no evidence of all-cause mortality reduction, which to me is the fundamental marker of efficacy. I know some people like to debate that, but to me, if the vaccine is not going to reduce my risk of death, why am I getting it? I think those two data points were enough for me that I would have said, time to pull these vaccines. They're not working, and they may actually be doing more harm than good, which we now believe that, especially for people continuing to get boosted, that does actually do more harm than good. And there's an emerging, I think, scientific consensus, at least on those who are actually following this issue, which of course is a minority of doctors and researchers. But amongst those of us who are COVID aware, there's definitely a consensus now that continuing to get boosted is definitely doing more harm than good and may increase your risk of not only getting COVID, but also having long COVID, as well as other consequences, what we call sequela in medicine, including possibly turbo cancers. And there's multiple researchers and oncologists now who are starting to blow the whistle on that reality.
Yes. And
Yeah.
so that's in our experience, in our practice, that's what we're starting to see, that high spike protein levels are directly linked to long COVID, directly related to cancer. And
Yeah, I mean, I would say long COVID for sure, direct relationship. I would say with cancer, it may be a somewhat of a direct relationship because of the cytotoxic effects of the spike protein, that it's causing cellular damage, which then results in cancer, maybe. But I think what's more apparent for sure for me is the indirect relationship that is still very important, which is that if the immune system is basically occupied dealing with persistent, pervasive spike protein and trying to eliminate that, and you have a really strong immune response that is targeted toward that, then you end up with a situation where there's fewer resources available from the immune system in order to combat whatever cancers may arise. So we know, for example, that you essentially have, over time, you've got this sort of reduction in the total antibody load that a person will have. You're sort of, I think it's within the first 6, maybe 9 months or a year, your antibody levels are peaked. And then gradually over the course of your life, they come down each decade lower and lower. And so this is one of the reasons why elderly people are most vulnerable to infection, is just they have a reduced capacity to fight infection because they have a reduced capacity to produce antibodies and respond to the infection. And the same is true of cancer. If you sort of distract the immune system with a lot of unnecessary spike protein, then it stands to reason there's going to be fewer of these resources available to go after whatever cancers may emerge. And so you'll see additional cancers that you otherwise wouldn't have seen. And we see that in both excess deaths as well as increased rates of certain cancers since COVID. But also you'll see it at younger ages. You'll see it progress more quickly, which is the other thing we're seeing. There's a lot of turbo cancers, which is basically cancers that go from sort of stage 0 to stage 4 in 6 months, or people who were in remission and then they come back for a checkup and it's stage 4. And that's typically not what we would see very often anyway, pre-COVID. So I think that's a reflection of the sort of immune dysregulation caused by the spike protein. Does that make sense?
yes,
Okay, great.
I'm thinking about most notably the 3 gentlemen that have come through our practice recently. Mr. G, they're all relatively young. They're all young gentlemen. This particular case, he'd been dealing with brain fog and fatigue for the last 6 months. And when he did his spike protein test through us, it was very high. The other gentleman, Mr. V, who has 7 children, has been suffering for the last year. The first one was vaccinated, second one wasn't, and the third one, his numbers are very high. Young guy, vaccinated 2 times, and has been experiencing major symptoms for the last year. So these are the stories that are on my heart. And then you have our last call. So we host calls to welcome people into our Aspen Wellness community. And when you have 3 people on a call of like 6 people, 3 people, 2 dealing with long COVID, and 1 dealing with cancer, it starts to really be a very concerning thing. Like, this may be the biggest blind spot that humanity has.
Well, certainly one of them from a health perspective. I would say that one of the things that is interesting about what you just said is that we, as an organization, FLCCC, is basically seeing that about 25% or so of the population, generally speaking, has an elevated anti-spike protein antibody titer. Elevated, really, it depends on, there's no standard definition yet of elevated, but basically above 400 units per milliliter is going to be the level that we have seen associated with symptoms. I tend to be a little more permissive in patients who were vaccinated and allow an anti-spike protein antibody titer of up to 2,000. In patients that are vaccinated, although we have patients that come to us and they say, I want to get unvaccinated. And I said, well, the best we can do is get your anti-spike protein antibody titers down below 400, which is the normal response in somebody, or the normal level that we've established as not being associated with symptoms in somebody who's unvaccinated. But what's so interesting is the other thing you just said, which is that sometimes we do see, I mean, people feel, I think there's like a sense of, well, I didn't get vaccinated, this doesn't apply to me. And the opposite is actually true. I mean, we absolutely see many people who come back with very high titers who were never vaccinated. But the reality of the matter is they have some sort of genetic susceptibility to the spike protein. Yeah. And so they have a really high antibody response and and some of them, I think, have a lot of, frankly, spike protein exposure. I mean, the number one place where you're getting spike protein is semen. So even if you're an unvaccinated female, but you're having intercourse with a man who is vaccinated or boosted, you could have a really high anti-spike protein antibody response, because every dose of that semen, you're getting more spike protein, and your immune system if you're someone who's genetically susceptible, that could be causing your levels to just skyrocket in terms of not only the spike protein you're getting exposed to, but also your immune response against it. And that can lead to all sorts of symptoms. I think mostly we see the most common symptoms are neurological, fatigue, brain fog, and other neurological symptoms, but there's other symptoms that we see as well. So it's not just neurological.
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
by the accounts of these people, these are life-altering symptoms they have.
Oh, yeah.
It's difficult for them to function on a moment-to-moment basis.
Yeah. Well, we have patients that come in and they say, oh, I feel 20% of normal, and I felt 20% of normal since I've got the vaccine or since I had COVID. I've never recovered from either of those. And sometimes it's just 1 dose for some people, but sometimes it's the 3rd or 4th dose. I mean, your likelihood of having adverse event against these vaccines actually goes up with each additional booster. It's the opposite of what a lot of people think. They think, oh, I got the first one, I was fine, might as well get a second one. But we have several patients who it's not until the 3rd dose or the 4th dose that they start actually getting really sick. And I think that there's sort of 2 things potentially going on there. There's a British physician who I believe is an oncologist. He's been on the FLCCC weekly webinar talking about how in cancer, we often see this phenomenon where 1 or 2 doses of a vaccine may actually reduce your risk of getting cancer, but then or the first one may reduce it and the second one kind of neutralizes it. But then when you get to the 3rd dose, the risk starts going up. And that's something that we knew about sort of pre-COVID, of giving too many doses potentially of a vaccine could increase the risk of cancer. And he says that's absolutely what he thinks is going on here. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a issue there. And also people are getting continuously re-exposed due to living in close proximity, working in close proximity, especially in more confined environments where there's not a lot of airflow, with people who are either sick from COVID or recently boosted. And recently, again, could maybe be in the last year. But
There's that woman who says she's continuously exposed in her workplace
sure.
because she knows that many of her coworkers are boosted.
Yeah, of course.
I asked you the other day what the implications are on children.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just learning about that. I think FLCCC just did a new weekly update as of the time we're filming this. I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, but it's literally about the cardiac implications of the COVID vaccines and spike protein more broadly on children. I think we're probably just seeing the tip of the iceberg on that. Will we see greater risk of cardiovascular issues with children who went through this and were vaccinated and boosted? Time will tell. What I will say is, I'm sure that there are some kids already dealing with some issues that may or may not be identified. See, that's one of the challenges that I think we experience as a practice, is that trying to explain to people that, hey, if you've had a new diagnosis or new onset of symptoms since either getting COVID or getting vaccinated, you need to get your anti-spike protein antibodies titers checked to see to what degree it is in fact COVID related. If your spike protein antibody titers are elevated, it very likely could be at least related to long COVID or vaccinosis, vaccine injury. You certainly want to rule that out. And we have patients that say, I've never felt well since I had COVID, and their titer levels are frankly pretty normal. And we have to say, look, probably maybe COVID started it, but it's no longer COVID associated. Whatever it is, it's got a life of its own, and it's something that you need to treat like it's very likely something you would have gotten either way. And the spike protein is the antibody titer is what can really help us distinguish that.
We have a 7-year-old.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you asked me about kids. I think time will tell, but I also think that the biggest message is stop getting boosted, please. Stop getting your kids boosted. Stop letting your grandkids get boosted. I really think that's going to be, kids are very resilient. They have a great ability to heal and a strong vitality in most cases, where they can recover from these things if given enough time. But that's the issue, is we need to make sure they have that time, and that time away from continued re-exposure. And the ways to do that is, first of all, have them stop getting boosters. And then the second thing would be obviously that their parents and other people they're going to be associating with on a regular basis stop getting boosted.
Yeah, we have a 7-year-old and an almost 3-year-old. Are you open to sharing how we are very intentional about heading that off? About amounting spike protein levels in our children's bodies?
Yeah, well, I think that the biggest ways we deal with that are with regard to the little guy. He's not 33 pounds yet, so we can't use ivermectin in him, but we do use the magic applesauce, which is basically the 250 milligrams of quercetin, 250 milligrams of N-acetylcysteine, and the version we use has some S-acetylglutathione in it as well, which has, each of these has different beneficial effects in COVID, which I could get into if you're interested in. And then 250 milligrams of vitamin C with bioflavonoids. And he does that, and he actually prefers it in yogurt because he doesn't really like applesauce as much.
Plain yogurt.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a plain goat yogurt is what we use, because otherwise it's going to be increasing mucus production if even you do cow dairy. But yeah, we do that twice a day, and he really recovers beautifully. And again, I think that quercetin is a zinc ionophore. It helps zinc get inside the cells. Zinc is virucidal. It kills viruses. He gets zinc from his daily multi-mineral. The vitamin C has both broad immune supportive effects. It also can help support detoxification. And then both glutathione and N-acetylcysteine have been shown to aid in the degradation of the spike protein. And then in addition to all that, with our 7-year-old, we do ivermectin.
I
Sorry, go
wanted to
ahead.
say the natural approach, the nutraceuticals, has worked for me. We're on a, we're intentionally wanting to get pregnant again. I've not been taking ivermectin. I did the spike protein test. My levels came through at very low. So it works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely think that if you're doing all of the natural things, including the NSC, the NAC, the glutathione, the Nigella, which you take every day, which also supports fertility. There's a lot of things that we do naturally now. And I've treated several patients with active COVID who were pregnant. And knock on wood, so far so good. Have had none of them have any complications with their pregnancy, have all recovered beautifully. And we've treated them 100% naturally just because with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. Well, with hydroxychloroquine, there's a slight association with the possibility of maybe some increase in birth defects. And then with ivermectin, there's like an animal study showing that, although there's a lot of human research showing that's not really an issue, at least epidemiologically. We look at populations that are taking ivermectin once a month or once a week even, and we don't see any increased risk of birth defects in those populations. Maybe that doesn't affect humans, but I would just say that it's out of an abundance of caution, we don't use it. If somebody wanted to use it maybe in the third trimester, I don't think it would be an issue, but it just, you have to weigh the variables. But in general, I don't use any drugs during pregnancy, and we have our patients recover beautifully. Yeah.
And how do you treat our 7-year-old?
Well, and again, like I said, in addition to the nutraceuticals, I'll give him some additional herbs depending on what his symptoms are. But I think primarily I will give him ivermectin, and we'll do the same that we do for active COVID. We do the double dose, and usually we do it, if we catch it early enough, it'll be a 24-hour disease. If we wait and then say, well, maybe he needs it, maybe he doesn't, then sometimes it takes 2-3 days. But if we say, well, first sign of anything, ivermectin, he has a fever that night, the next morning he wakes up ready to run.
And both our boys are quite active and functional, even when they have symptoms.
Oh, that's also true, right? Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And that's whether it's COVID or frankly the flu or parvovirus B19 or whatever it is, they tend to be really active and continue to have good energy and everything else because we're treating aggressively, holistically, and getting ahead of it. And also they take regular nutraceuticals, which kind of makes the immune terrain a lot more agile and able to shift and deal with this infection or that infection, and also have the capacity to do so in a way that's appropriate and measured and not an overreaction, because that can be as much of a problem in a lot of people as an underreaction. And yeah, they do beautifully. We've never had to prescribe them antibiotics, never had to have them go to the hospital for an infection.
I mean,
On wood, so far so good.
Want to also mention that the whole family, including the boys, are on a very rigorous, personalized diet that honors their physiology and their genetics.
Yeah.
And we're very intentional about not giving them refined sugars and excess grains.
Well, just to clarify, so they're on the blood type diet for their blood type, which is what we recommend for children under 8. We don't do the SWAMI, which is the more advanced form of nutritional personalization with the software, where we're doing a lot of measurements and things, because epigenetically there's not enough information at that age to really make a determination about their epigenotype. But yeah, so we
do know that our 7-year-old is not. So if you're talking about these distinctions, we do know that he's not mold susceptible, and we're about to do that test for our 2-year-old.
Yeah. Well, that sort of gets more into the realm of biotoxins and less about nutrition, which is really, I mean, it can affect nutrition in the realm of mushrooms, right? And
blue type of food anyhow.
Fungusy things, but most of those are not great for typos anyway. But yeah, the boys are basically on the typo secretor diet because they're secretors and they're typos. And the Diadamo diets really are the most advanced form of nutritional personalization that I'm aware of. As typos, they do thrive on a grain-free or mostly grain-free. We do have rice occasionally, mostly paleo primal type mindset. is true. And that's going to be about 50% of the population, which is the reason why those diets are so successful, broadly speaking. But then, of course, you have another 50% of the population that do really well either on an omnivorous diet or more of even a vegetarian, pescatarian type diet.
I will
And
say we've had type O's that were on a vegan or vegetarian diet that came to us because they were losing their hair, they were gaining excess weight, and they're just experiencing a host of symptoms. So personalized diet really has an impact.
of course, yeah, I mean, it's the foundation of our practice. It's been the foundation of my practice since before I met you, and really is what got me into medicine to begin with, was my interest in nutrition, specifically personalized clinical nutrition, using nutrition to prevent and treat disease. And Dr. Diadamo was really my first mentor and, foremost mentor in that realm. And yeah, but I've absolutely seen it be helpful to patients dealing with long COVID, dealing with any kind of chronic immune activation. Because part of what we're doing is we're taking things out of the diet that will cause an immune response. So if you're eating a diet that's highly immunogenic, your immune system is always going to be fighting off what you're eating. And as a result, it's not only wasting its resources, but it's also upregulating its response because it feels like its experiences that it's always under attack by its environment. It's constantly having to deal with things that are not, well, the best way to understand it is to say things that are not self, right? So if you eat foods that are compatible with your immunology, then your immune system is going to see them and say, okay, well, that's within the realm of acceptable things that I'm used to being exposed to and that are not too different from myself immunologically to create this big response. But a lot of times that's what we're seeing in, for example, type O's who eat a lot of wheat or corn or dairy products, or it just causes a lot of chronic inflammation because there's like this, it fuels a constant, consistent immune response. Similarly with type A's who are eating a lot of white potatoes,
Yeah.
tomatoes, bananas, red meat, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I attribute, because I'm also your patient since we met,
Yeah,
I
just
attribute
about.
everything that you have me doing holistically as really empowering my fertility journey as well. We were pregnant within the first month of trying when I was 39, naturally. I was pregnant within 6 months of trying at 43 years old. And my experience of life is one of aliveness.
Mhm. Beautiful. No alacrity.
Aliveness and alacrity.
Okay,
That's
good.
what I'm
Good. I
committed
was
to being the embodiment of.
She usually says aliveness and alacrity, so that's a little bit of an inside joke. But yeah, great. Well, I love it. I love to hear that. And
May we talk about the spike protein or high levels, how they're impacting fertility?
yeah, well, that was actually going to say something about that. First, I'll start with diet and then let's circle back to spike protein.
Okay.
So this is another way in which the diet can affect fertility. And it's one of the big ways that the blood type diet and the Diadamo diets more generally are beneficial in cases of fertility, is that if you, let's say, have a blood type incompatibility between yourself and your spouse, which we don't have, but let's say we did, right? Like my parents, for example, where my mom is a type A and my dad is a type O. That's not actually the best example. What are your parents' blood type? A and B. Okay, so that's a better example. So let's say your mom, who's a type A, will be eating a lot of food that has the B like antigen glycoprotein in it, which is how we develop blood type antibodies or anti-blood type antibodies in the first place, is through the food we're eating. It's not, oh, we got a transfusion somehow, and that's why we now have a reaction against these other blood types. No, the other organisms, bacteria, as well as I think certain viruses and food, have these antigens, which are very similar, if not identical, to the antigens found on other blood groups. And so our body creates this immune response as a result of exposure to those because it knows that's not me. right? That's not self, that's other, and it wants to protect against other. And if you have, say, a spouse, like in the case of your parents, where your dad was a type B, if your mom were eating too many foods that looked like type B, then that could impair her fertility. And we see that over and over again. In the case of your parents, they had 2 kids, very healthy, wonderful kids. But in the case of many people that we've dealt with, that can be an issue, especially if the diet is not, where you'd like to see it. Because what happens is that you're actually increasing the sensitivity of that type A body against type B antigens. And so anytime the type B semen comes through, there's a stronger immune response against it. And then also any type of embryo that would be type B would also get more likely to be attacked. And so there's an overall increase in immune surveillance and activity against the opposing blood group antigen if you have that blood type incompatibility and you're not eating in a way to reduce that. And so that's how it affects fertility. And we've seen that over and over again. The other thing I would say related to spike protein is, and there's a reproductive endocrinologist, at least one, that has spoken on the FLCCC weekly update about this, where the cytotoxic effects of spike protein have resulted in increases in miscarriages, spontaneous abortions, as well as we did a whole lecture. I mean, I did a whole kind of podcast. It's not really a podcast, but it was more of a seminar type format on this very topic, on spike protein and fertility, and how it affects menstrual cycles and how it affects not just also hormone levels. It's really fascinating. So I would encourage, we'll need to go grab that before we do anything else. So, I mean, really in response to that question, I would just, rather than recapping that whole lecture, I would just maybe put that down in the description or something like that to say,
we'll link it.
Yeah, let's provide the link that, because there are many different effects. And that is something which I delve into in depth in that and actually do a literature review where I go study by study and point out some of the findings that we have now. Anything else you want to say about any of the spike protein related things?
Well, if our listeners and our community are if you're called to get your spike protein, how does spike protein levels tested?
Spike protein antibody levels tested.
Okay.
Yeah.
Feel free to contact our office. And here's the number and our information. We'll be very happy to support you with that.
Well, and for those who may be listening that may be visually challenged, our number is 760-284-8403. And what was the other thing you wanted to? I just want to make sure we put it in the audio as well. So
yes, or you can email office at drpartovi.com.
Right. That's drpartovi.com.
All right. And if your levels come back high, we can support you with that, with the detoxification, not only using the FLCCC protocol, we're also going to join with it the mastery that Dr. Ryan has in integrative and holistic medicine.
Yeah, and everything we talked about in terms of our wellness plan, everything we talked about today regarding personalized clinical nutrition is absolutely the cornerstone, the foundation of the wellness plan. And everybody who is getting treated for long COVID in our practice receives a personalized nutrition plan, recipe book, meal planner for where they are right now on their health journey.
I gotta tell you, that's my favorite business baby. So many people have seen such a transformation just within a few months of being on the wellness plan.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us on this episode of the Partovi Effect, Creating the Consensus, with myself, Dr. Ryan Partovi.
And Madi Partovi.
It's been a pleasure to have you join us today. Thank you for your time, attention, engagement, participation in our community, and we look forward to continuing to grow and develop alongside each other.